Welcome to the Solid Signal Podcast for the week of December 31st, 2018. This is the first week of the year, first week of 2019. I guess I'm counting it that way, even though today it's December 31st. But I did 52 podcasts last year, so I guess this must be the first one of the next year. And it's year 7 of our Solid Signal Podcast, so I want to thank everybody who's been with me since the beginning, well over 300 podcasts at this point, and I'm pretty impressed by that. I'm pretty proud of myself, to be very honest with you. I thought this year maybe I'd try to focus a little bit more on tutorial content. It's been brought to my attention that I do a lot of rants and raves and stuff like that, and I think those are the kind of podcasts that tend to get a lot of listenership, but they don't necessarily, I don't know how to put it, move the needle, I guess, from point A to point B. At any rate, we'll see how that goes. Let's start with something kind of scientific. And let me tell you, if you're a physics teacher, you're probably going to disagree with some of the things that I say because I'm trying to make this as easy as possible to try to talk about. And so I'm going to avoid some of the more complex and thorny bits so that everybody can kind of agree that they understand the idea. If you're talking about orbiting is a very interesting combination. It's an interesting dance because what you have is you have an object in space spinning around another object. That spinning gives it the force that it needs to fly away from that thing at high speed. And, you know, if you've ever played with a top or ridden a roller coaster, you'll understand what centrifugal force is. It's that tendency that something has as it's spinning to just fly off into space. And perfectly matched with that is the idea that this thing could be falling. Gravity is constantly pulling it down. And so there's this one speed for any distance that you're at. There's a speed at which the thing's tendency to fly away is perfectly matched by gravity's tendency to pull it back. And so it stays at exactly the same distance all the time. The closer you get to the Earth, the higher that speed is, and the further away you get from Earth, the lower that speed is, which is why it takes the moon a month to go around the Earth, and why something like the space shuttle can do 6 orbits all, in the course of a day. This is, this kind of orbital mechanics is something that we really began to understand in the 20th century because it was necessary. As we started to want to put things up into space, we had to understand what would make them apparently stay there. And I'll go back to that for a second because we talk about something orbiting the Earth and how it just kind of stays in a stable orbit. It doesn't stay in a stable orbit. It's constantly fighting to fly away and get pulled down and fly away and get pulled down. And when you're talking about a communication satellite, you're going to have some way of it to correct from time to time because over time, the tendency of Earth to pull it back down is going to win. That's just how that works. And I would have to assume that that's true of just about everything that's up there, that eventually it will come down because the pull of the Earth will win over. It's kind of insidious that way. So, as I said, the faster the thing needs to go, it needs to be closer to the Earth, and the slower it tends to go, that's the further away it goes from the Earth. So, a guy named Arthur C. Clarke, who was a science fiction writer in the 20th century, if you've never heard of him, knew this because a lot of this stuff had already been figured out before he got there. And he had an idea that there was this point where, okay, if it's going faster as it's closer and it's going slower as it's further away, there was this point where it was just far enough away that the speed it orbited was exactly the same as the speed of an Earth's orbit. In other words, you see, we tend to think of geostationary orbit, like what communication satellites have, as the satellite just hanging in place, but it's really not. It's just that it's traveling at exactly the same speed as the Earth, and it's kind of like when you're in one lane on the highway and somebody else is on another lane and you're going exactly the same speed, and it looks like neither of you are moving. So you have at this point of about 22,000 miles up, a satellite is going to go around the Earth in exactly one day. And since the Earth is going around in exactly one day, it seems to hang right in space. And that number, by the way, is specific to the equator. If the thing were closer to the North Pole or to the South Pole, that number would change, which is another reason that you find that satellites tend to hang around the equator so that they can take advantage of the math that everybody already knows and that they already have. So you have this thing, and it's going around, give or take, in one day, and therefore it appears to be hanging over a fixed position in space. And because it's hanging over a fixed position in space, then you can point an antenna at it, and you can receive stuff from it. If it weren't in a fixed position in space, then you'd have to aim your satellite dish constantly. As a matter of fact, it would be practically impossible to do anything, because if a communication satellite were only 100 miles up, it'd be moving around so quickly that you wouldn't be able to track it. Now, of course, NASA has got satellite dishes that will track things, and they've got big motors on them, and that's how that stuff works. But you, at home, with your relatively small satellite dish, are not going to be able to do that. From the point that we figured out that, okay, you can put a satellite up and it's going to orbit in the same time that it takes the Earth to orbit, it all comes down to relatively simple kind of math at that point. It's all really triangles. How long does it take for the signal to get up? How long does it take for the signal to get down? What does it take to push a signal up there? Because as signals go up, they get weaker. As they go down, they get weaker still. So what's the weakest signal that you're going to be able to get? And you back up and you do all this math to say, okay, well, how much stronger does it need to be when it starts in order to be strong enough to be received when it's done traveling a total of 44,000 miles, right, 44,000 miles. This kind of stuff is neat, but what's nice about it is it's a series of relatively simple equations. If you've actually made it through 10th or 11th grade mathematics, you can figure those calculations out, and you can kind of basically understand it. Of course, most of us who went through that kind of math don't really remember it, and we just have to take it for granted. Anyway, the bottom line, though, is that things in geostationary orbit, when we think about, how do they just hang in space? They don't hang in space. That's kind of the most important takeaway here. They just orbit at the same time the Earth is orbiting, and that's what's kind of neat about it. And the guy who figured it out went on to do a whole bunch of really other interesting things, wrote a lot of interesting books, and the film 2001: A Space Odyssey, and he's considered one of the greatest futurists of the 20th century. And this was just one little tiny bit of his legacy. Anyway, that's my bite-sized chunk of tutorial for today. And I will give you a little bit more next week. And in the meantime, have a great one. If it hasn't been New Year where you are, have a great and Happy New Year. Oh, and I also said that I would spend this year just mentioning SolidSignal.com a little bit more. Shop at SolidSignal.com because it's got all the great stuff that you want at great prices with great service. And naturally, I'm a big fan because they pay for this podcast and pay for my salary. That's about it for me for the week. I will talk to you again soon.